Hi, in this section we're going to talk about observation, and observation is something that you will, as you become more confident with it, you'll be noticing things that you really weren't paying attention to before in every aspect of the work that you do with animals. So observation and communication are two things that are quite important. We can look at communication as the concept of calming signals or language. Calming signals were really first talked about by Rodriguez, and we'll get into the details of those as we go along. We can look at the physical characteristics that we might see with the dog, the body posture, interactions that they may have with people, with other dogs, or with other animals, their overall body balance, the way that they move, and their coping skills in a variety of situations. One thing important about observation is that we do it without judgment. We're not looking to come to a conclusion about something, but rather to simply see what we're noticing in that moment in time. And that can change depending on the context, the time of day, if an animal's hungry, if they've just eaten, if they're in a new situation, and if they feel comfortable or not. So how can we really have to think about observing without judgment? And a good analogy of that or example is folded arms. And, what does it mean? And some people will say, well, if your arms are folded, it means that you're, closed. If someone's talking to you, you're not open to their suggestions. It could mean that. It could also mean that they're cold. It could mean that their back is sore, and that's a more comfortable way for them to do it. So if we can simply notice what's happening, the same with the dogs, and not make a judgment about it, that can really be helpful in working with animals. So in our observation, we can look at the coping response that they might have. So that might be in when they come into a new situation, what do they do? That's what we might notice. Their interaction with different people, what their posture might look like. Do they move with a limp? Do they move equally one side to the other? And what physical characteristics do we notice? That might be the position of the tail, position of the ears, attention that they may carry in different parts of the body. So we can look at this overall mind map of observation, and when we're first meeting a dog, and this would be the sort of our initial observation that we're making, if you're working with a client, or even if you're with your own dog, what you might think about doing is imagining that it wasn't your dog. So if you were to think about, what's the dog, what do you love about your dog, what would you like to change? And I often ask people is, what would make your life easier if it was different in terms of their behavior? Because at some level, the behavior must work for the dog or they wouldn't do it. So we can look at the top in terms of interaction, talking about calming signals, and there's a whole variety of them that we'll look into a little bit more closely. Interaction, are they different with an unfamiliar person, with environment, with other dogs? If there happen to be other animals in the area, it could be horses, it could be if there's traffic, if there's bicycles or motorcycles. Looking at the posture, the tail position, does it tend to wag evenly or does it wag to one side? What's their head position? Is it high or low? What do their ears look like? What are their eyes? And most of us are not symmetrical. So this idea of symmetry is not many beings are totally symmetrical, but it can be interesting to notice that. You can pay attention to the respiration. You can notice, do they crouch? What's their top line? Do they tend to roll over when they're faced with an unfamiliar situation? What do they do? If we look at movement, do they move in balance? Do they seem to be limping a little bit? Are they quick? Are they slow? What is their coordination? Do they look organized in their movement? How are they on a leash with their own person, with a stranger? Do they seem to be kind of well-grounded, or are they moving around quickly and seem to be kind of really light on their feet? The physical characteristics, we can look at the coat texture, the temperature, their eyes, the teeth, their weight, their smell, the muscle tension they seem to have, their reaction to touch. What's happening? Is their mouth seem dry, or are they drooling? Do they have sweaty paws, which you might see on depending on the flooring? Are they shedding? And these can all be signs of some kind of stress. And I think sometimes the word stress is used in a way that people is always negative. Anytime we go into an unusual situation, we're often, there's a certain amount of stress that's going to happen. In order for any change to take place, there has to be healthy amounts of stress. And when I say healthy amounts, if there's too much stress, there's a hormone called ACTH that is released and it blocks learning. So we have to be really careful because we don't know what level each being is within a comfort zone and not within a comfort zone. So giving animals lots of pauses and lots of opportunity to make choice is important. We also want to look at the coping response. When they come to a new situation, or do they hide behind their owner? Do they stiffen? They slow down? Do they go into fool around? Do they freeze? Do they sit? Do they lie down? Do they roll over? What do they do? So if we're looking at posture, the details of posture, and this might be something interesting for you to do if you have your own dog or a friend's dog, is start to pay attention to these things, and not within a way of judging it, but simply noticing in that moment in time, what are you seeing? So posture is definitely linked to behavior. And if you think about the dog that is really shy, the head may be down, the tail may be tucked, they may be crouching a little bit, as opposed to the dog that might be really kind of over the top or a bit reactive in situations, and they might be, or a little anxious, they might have their head up, they might be stiff through the back, and their tail might be tight. So we can get some ideas about how animals might respond by looking at these things. So if we look at the head position, is it high or low or held to one side? Is it crooked? What do we see with that? The ears, are they tense? Are they back? Are they forward? Are they pricked up? And of course that will depend on the shape of your dog's ears. I've met a dog, a little beautiful little staffy, and his ears were so tight, and he had a lot of tension, wrinkles between between the ears on the top of his head, that he was literally wet behind the ears. So when I just gently went to work his ear and move his ear a little bit, I could actually, it was damp in that because his ears were held back so tightly, and it was a very warm day. And apparently that's how he had been most of the time. We made a huge influence by simply gently moving the ears in different ways, and that changed a lot about the tension around his head. So we look at the eyes. Are they staring? Are they soft? Are they enlarged pupils? Or is there a whale eye? And you have to take into account too, with some dogs, you know, what is their normal? Like, so you can ask the owner, or if it's your dog, what is their kind of normal demeanor of the eye? And does it change in a new situation? Is the face tight? Are the lips tight? Is the muzzle, are there wrinkles around the muzzle? Sometimes there'll even be hair swirls with that. Look at the symmetry. How organized is he in the limbs? Is the footfall even? You can even look at that whole idea of symmetry in the face. Is the respiration fast or slow? And sometimes as soon as anything happens, you'll notice a slight change in respiration, or a big change. Are they rolling over and going into fool around? Do they grab the lead? And if they do, notice, when does that happen? Is it when a stranger walks up to them? Is it when they get touched in an unusual way? Just simply notice those things. So notice the balance. Do they tend to stand squarely or unevenly? Or when they go to sit, do they sit on one hip? Do they always lie down on one side? And it's simply find out what is their normal, what normally happens. Sometimes it'll be that they've had maybe some kind of an injury or an accident, and they started, if people really think about it, they'll realize that suddenly started to become their habit. You can look at the top line, and we talked about this idea. Is the back hollow? Is it tight? Is it roached? Meaning, is there a little curve over the back? And that can happen when they're tight in the belly, for instance. It may happen when they're nervous. So just pay attention to that. Do they crouch or hug the ground? Or do they kind of stand rather firmly in place? Is the tail tucked? Is it down? Is it more to one side than the other? So these are all things that you can simply observe and notice, do they change? So if we look at calming signals, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with that, but basically, Tour Rodriguez started to look at behavior that dogs would do that she sort of cited as when maybe they were either trying to give off signals to another dog to say, I'm okay, whether they were trying to calm you or the other dog or calm themselves. I don't think we can really know that. So some of the calming signals are blinking or looking away, and that is kind of good social skills. You don't stare at someone that may be nervous or coming into a situation. You might look at them and then look away. That often helps relax any being, actually. They might turn their whole head away. They might lick their lips or yawn. They may walk in an arc. My dogs at home they're off leash most of the time. We live in a farm. And if a new dog comes, they don't run straight up to it. They may go towards it and then they kind of arc to approach from the side. And that's a less threatening way to approach a being that may be a little bit nervous about you. They may do a play bow. They may simply go into fool around. They may sniff the ground. And I see that often with my dogs when another dog comes that appears quite nervous, and suddenly my dogs will get very interested in some smell that has been there all the time, but it's more interesting now. And it is likely that it's a way of them simply going, you know what, I'm okay. Scratching. Lots of dogs, they scratch because they're itchy, but sometimes they scratch as a displacement behavior or calming signal. They may sit or lie down. And we had a lovely big dog that lived with us for a long time. And he looked like a big black bear. His name was Benson. And when I remember one day there was a puppy that came and the puppy was really nervous of Benson because he did look like a bear. So what Benson did is he just laid down and he just was completely neutral and allowed the puppy to come up and sniff all around him. And then when he felt it was appropriate, he kind of got up and moved away and the puppy followed him. And it was a lovely way for him to introduce himself to the puppy. Shaking off can also be a calming signal. And humans, we're the only being that actually doesn't have this kind of complete ability to really shake things off without really thinking about it. And, we can kind of shake ourselves off, but not the same way that a dog can, a horse can, a cat can. And it seems like sometimes it's about kind of shaking things off. And so being able to shake it off can also be rather relaxing. Now, you have to look at the context. If we see a dog that's panting, we have to think about, yes, maybe the dog is a little bit concerned. Maybe it's a very hot day. So we really have to look at that. So it's important to, whenever you're in doubt, simply give a pause or change a situation. That is rarely is a negative thing to do and can often really help an animal. So when we're observing, the easiest thing that we can do initially if we're sighted is to use our eyes. So we can look at the body, we can look for movement, we can look at their movement, their posture, tension that they may be carrying. And you can see this little dog on the right looks a little bit tense as he's kind of going after the dog with the ball, which is probably what he wants. Look at the hair pattern. And hair patterns are interesting because it's really looking at change that happens, not necessarily, fluffy dogs or dogs that have long coats. They may have swirls, and they may have always had swirls. What you're looking for is to see if it's changed. We want to notice what their response to touch is and into unfamiliar situations. So I rarely make contact physically with the dog initially when I meet them. I like them to be able to engage with me rather than me engaging with them, and notice how they respond to that. We also want to look at that sort of the physiological, what the respiration rate, what the heart rate, which of course you'd have to put your hand on the dog. You can look sometimes if their mouth looks dry, do they seem hot or cold? And that's where we would have to get our hands on them. But what do their eyes look like? Are their eyes glassy? Are they soft? So those are things that we can see. Looking at the characteristics indicating the potential concern. If they're licking, if they're chewing on something in an agitated way, if they're urinating too often, if they're vocalizing, if they have an open mouth, etc. And then, of course, we can start to use our hands and feel the body for the reaction. Now, what I suggest to people is that if you're working with someone else's dog and you don't know the dog, or the dog is not comfortable with you, talk the person through it. And it's a great skill to learn, because many people have never touched their dog in a different way or an unusual way. And so you have to guide them through it so that they can make contact in a way that's a little bit unfamiliar for the dog. So we can watch for their coping mechanisms when we put them into new situations. When a stranger walks up, do they hide behind their owner? Do they try to get away? Do they growl? Do they freeze? Do they sit? Do they go into fool around? Are they overly excited to see someone they don't know? What's their demeanor? Do they get really slow? Do they stiffen? So these are all different coping mechanisms, and all of these things, the same as calming signals, what they are is they're a response of the nervous system in a way to help the being cope. So one of the other ways that you can, and this is a little bit new in the work, is using free work as a way to observe. And what that basically is if you have a safe space to let your dog off leash completely with no collar, no harness on, and put up a variety of elements, like we use different surfaces. We might use poles, we might use a lick mat, a slow feeder. You might have some bicycle tires that are in a different pattern, or some hula hoops, whatever you happen to have. You want to put some food down, and snuffle mats are fantastic for this, and put a little bit of food in them as long as it's okay for that dog. You don't want to only put food on the elements, so that you want to notice, are they nervous about going to certain things? They get to still get a little bit of food and have a nice sniff without having to engage with different elements. If you can't have the dog free, a light long line can be attached, and just teach the handler, just follow the dog so that they're not having any influence. What you start to see is you see things like movement, especially when you can have them completely free. Something like the tags on the collar can actually make a difference to how what a dog's posture is like. So when they go completely free, you may notice a very different head posture. You might notice that the dog always goes in one direction. And that can really come out when you see dogs that have problems on the lead. They may be reactive on maybe when you're in certain situations. And it could be that's because if you lead your dog only from the right side, and they happen to be really stiff and they're habituated to mostly going left because they're comfortable, that's going to make them more uncomfortable when you take them right. So you can start to see what's happening with the dog. You can often see different patterns of movement. Dogs that start out really quickly will often slow down, and it can be a great non-habitual experience. I recommend it, and people have been using it for a while now in the UK. When they go to see a new client, they might take a snuffle mat and a few different surfaces and simply have the dogs start that out as their first session. So it gives the dog a very unusual experience about having someone a stranger in the house. You get to see the movement, so does the owner. You can really talk about it, allow the dog to really have that sense of freedom. And for most dogs, about 10 minutes is where they're interested in it. And we'll have more information on that as we go through the program. So understanding how posture relates to and directly influences behavior can be very helpful in giving you valuable information about why and how your dog reacts. Tension patterns is a term that was coined by Sarah Fisher, and there's a very good article by her that is in here in one of your references. And it's really looking at are there areas of tightness that exist in the dog's body? And it might affect the way that a dog functions in an emotional, mental, or physical level. It can not only affect how the dog thinks, feels, and learns, but hamper the dog's ability to be trained and to be adaptive in new situations. So some of the areas that you can look at in the body that indicate tension patterns. Let's just see, what have we done here? So one of the questions, of course, is why do they occur? It can be simply from an injury. So if, and this is one thing you have to be so careful of even in dog parks or when dogs play together, is that one dog can really hurt another dog. So if they've been injured, it's going to alter their normal posture and movement the same way that it would us. So even once it's healed, you may find that the dog has adapted a posture that was functional, but is actually now creating more compensation patterns. They may have a medical problem. Changes in hormones, thyroid imbalance, arthritis, and hip dysplasia can all create tension, because pain is a huge motivator for our body to try to find another way to be comfortable. Trauma, shock of an accident, or emotional upheaval can trigger tension patterns. So can stress. That can really influence behavior. A move, a change in the family dynamic. There's so many things that can create that in our animals. Management and training, either lack of exercise, inappropriate environment, unsuitable training methods, they can all cause stress. So can poor nutrition and food allergies. They can be born like that. Some dogs present tension patterns right from birth, and there's some puppies that have high level of tension in the skin and other parts of the body. They'll often be more vocal, more demanding. They may be more reactive to hand contact. They may be tending to be mouthier, to bite hard. That can make a huge difference. So it's not always what's happened to them or something we've done. It can be the genetic predisposition for any number of reasons. So how do we identify these? We can watch the dog move both on and off the leash. We can observe how he holds himself. We can examine the whole body with the flat of the hand, looking for hot or cold spots. And I often recommend to people that they start with the back of the hand. You'll be able to feel temperature difference. You'll be able to feel heat better with the back, and cold often better with the palm because of the difference in the natural temperature of the hand. Differences in coat texture, lumps and bumps. So you may in the coat texture find dry, starey areas, and those areas that are really dry and maybe kind of scurfy. They're often areas that are that carry some tension, and the dog may be more sensitive in those areas. The skin might twitch, or the muscles underneath might twitch when they're touched, and there may be just tension around the skin in different areas. The dog reacting when you touch them in a certain area. So here's some things that we can look at that we may find that are then tense if we put our hand on them, but just notice the difference in this lovely dog's ears. Now this could be, that's how it is, and it could be because there's more tension in one ear than there is in another ear. And of course, spots on a Dalmatian can be very deceiving in terms of looking at what we're seeing with them. Now, this little dog here, you see how different the left ear is from the right ear. That could just be, how he was born. We also notice right now that he's standing in a way. Now, if this was a habit that he stood with one leg straight, this might just be an accident, then he might be trying to compensate for something. Now, this little dog is sitting on one hip. That also could be an accident. It could be because it's more comfortable for him because of a hip. It could simply be that it happened to be that he sat on his right hip. If, however, that's a pattern, you may want to look at it. Dogs that have hip dysplasia will often sit more easily or more readily on one hip than the other. Now, this little dog, you see how different his ears are, and also the eyes. The shape of the eye is different in either side. So these are just things that if we don't look for things, we will never see them. Now, this little dog, you can see a lot of tension along the jaw. You can see the white of his eyes. You can see tension between his ears and the pattern that way he's holding his ears. This was a very difficult puppy. He was a very difficult dog when he was a puppy. Made huge changes, but had he not had intervention, his life would have been likely quite different. So now if we look at the body, this is a dog that had very, very bad hip dysplasia. Dogs that have a tendency to be reactive, you'll normally start to see more hair coat pattern changes over the shoulders and over the hip area. So again, what we're looking for is change in the coat pattern, not simply because they had a bath, or maybe they've always been like that. This little dog had spondylosis in that area where the hair is sticking up, and that was something that had changed, and the coat pattern had changed when and the dog's behavior started to change, and when they had the dog checked, they found that it had spondylosis. So when we're feeling with our hands, we can I generally start with the back of my hand, because again, I mentioned about feeling the temperature differences. So we have all these options of what we can look for. The coat texture, right? Rough or smooth. Do you notice that at certain places where the coat changes pattern, that suddenly your dog maybe starts to move around, goes a little bit into fool around, moves away from the hand contact, wants to face you, rolls on their back, because they're looking for ways of just very politely keeping you away from those areas where maybe they're not so comfortable. Are there any hot spots? How do the extremities feel? And you may have to use the back of the hand, because many dogs are not comfortable with their legs and feet being touched. How do they, feel in terms of their weight? Are they underweight, overweight? Is the belly tight? You can notice all of these things. Does the skin feel tight as you run your hand along the body? Is there twitching of the muscles? Are the ears tight around the base, or they feel kind of spongy? Do they feel soft in the response? How do they react to your touch? Do they move away from you? Do they become a little bit too aroused? Do they start to give you some kind of calming signals? Do they simply want to get away from it? And you can, just sort of roughly look at the mouth. Do the teeth look clean, or some rotten? Is there a smell about the mouth? Are the lips pinched? Or is the mouth is it kind of wet and moist? So is he really drooling a lot? So those are all kind of indicators that there could be tension in those kinds of areas. Are the legs, are the feet sweaty, clammy? Do they have tight paws? Do they have long fingernails? Now, you may not get to this all in the beginning, but these are things that you can really start to pay attention to. So with your own dog, you can use stroking down the body and use the back of the hand. And if you can get people to go slow, that makes a big difference. I don't go in necessarily long strokes. I want to go slowly and see when I get to a certain point, and often it's kind of in the middle of the back, does my dog kind of move around? So I might say, well, maybe that's just accidental. So I might go back to the place just before where they seem comfortable, and then try that a couple of times and see if it was just an accident, or if it's actually, maybe there's a little bit of tension, or there's a little concern in that area. We can use the circular touches going along the spine, which we'll teach you as we go along in the course. We can use a little bit of the zebra. So there's various touches that we could use to also start to make a little bit of contact with the body, with your own dog in particular. We can do some basic ear slides, and many people will just automatically stroke their dog's ears if they put their head in the lap. Not every dog is comfortable with it, particularly if they've had ear infections, especially have sort of continual ear infections. But there's ways that you can approach the ears if that's the case that we can show you. We want to see how they are about basic touch, or just contact around the mouth and the tail, around the belly, and all over the body. Do they accept your contact? You can check or watch for temperature differences, tightness in the muscle, feeling of tension in the skin, texture differences in the coat. Could be that it's dry. It could be that it starts to swirl in different ways. There could be shedding or dandruff. And what happens? What kinds of signals or language is a dog trying to tell you when we're making this contact? Do they move away from us? Do they get overly aroused? Do they go into fool around? So these are all things that we can really pay attention to. And while you're doing the exploration, could you simply change the way you're making contact? Change the back of the hand, go a little bit lighter, go to a different area, and see if that changes how your dog responds to you. Remember, observe without judging. Observations are ongoing. Maybe it's context specific, and that's really important part about not judging. It could be in some contexts they have a certain response, and in others they have different ones. Be aware of how your interactions affect your dog. Do you have a habitual way that you make contact that maybe your dog has gotten used to, but perhaps actually is not as comfortable as we might think? Having this baseline of observation will give you a better ability to notice if there's change. Because if you don't know what's there, you'll never know if something changes. So enjoy these observations, because you may be fairly surprised about the things that you can find about your dogs. Now, what we'll include in this is some little sheets that you could do, some check sheets that will give you reminders, and that maybe you can keep track of how your dog feels from one day to the next in terms of being of the observations that you're doing and the contact that you have with them. So enjoy this process, and let's see what happens next.